Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Andy Root, and we just had a lot of fun spending a week in Berlin, teaching together a class on Bonhoeffer with 25 American souls. No, they weren't all American. We had Canadians.
We had some Canadians, yeah.
And we had someone from Mexico who is an American citizen, I believe.
Right. Who lives in Mexico.
But we had a good time doing
Great
Bonhoeffer
time.
in Bonhoeffer's house.
Yep.
And now we're back. While we were there, I was like, Andy, I want to record a podcast in Bonhoeffer's house, specifically in his bedroom, and more specifically while sitting on his bed.
Yeah.
And Andy...
We did sit on his bed together, but we didn't record anything.
We did? I don't know. I'm pretty sure you said I wasn't allowed to share those photos.
You're not allowed to share those photos.
Okay.
I'm just letting people know the photos exist. But
they exist. Just like the Jeffrey Epstein files. They exist until they don't. Why are people asking me for these photos?
There may have been a themed picture on the bed, but that could be interpreted as disrespectful, so we will not allow those pictures to see the light of day.
Oh. I don't know if it was exactly the pose so much as all the leather you were wearing, but anyway.
I never go to Berlin without my leather gear.
Reasonable.
Yeah.
Reasonable. So now you've taken students there before and such. Now this time we filled the room up. We had quite a mix of generations and clergy, to lay people, to people that weren't sure about their religious status and came, and it was a really cool mix of students and such. What do you call it? They're not students because it's not like a real class, but everyone was learning. I don't know.
Yeah.
The people that hung out with us for a week.
Yeah, I think that's the way to call it. Yeah.
Fellow learners. See, Eddie,
pilgrims on the path of Bonhoeffer, something kind of.
They got bond-pilled.
They got what? What?
Bond-pilled. It's like getting red-pilled for Bonhoeffer.
You take the S-Bahn to Heerstrasse, and then you get bond-pilled.
I know, but so what was unique this time about getting to go to Berlin and how things played out? Like, or maybe say just a bit about what all your goals are when you're putting it together and everything, and and if I ruined it.
No, well, you definitely didn't ruin it. Yeah, I mean, it always really is. I mean, we just kind of made fun of this, but it is a kind of Protestant pilgrim experience. You know, like Bonhoeffer is a kind of Protestant saint, though, few of us would feel comfortable with that. Maybe we should be, but I think people come and just being in that space, that's at the very house that he was arrested at, his bedroom still set up like it is that we've referenced. Yeah, I'm always amazed in some sense how easy teaching the class is, because it's just about being in that space and telling that story. What was unique this time that I've never done before was, one, teach it with someone else. So it was a real pleasure trip to teach it with you. And yeah, it's too bad. I mean, I guess it's good too that we didn't record anything like from our lectures in the house, but those listening in will not be surprised. Trip had some bangers of some riffs on ethics. It was great, and on letters and papers, there were some really great elements there. So it was fun for me to kind of sit back and listen to you do your thing. That was great and was different than what I usually experience. And then the other thing that we did just kind of directly as an outing is we went to the Niemöller house, which I had not done before. And yeah, that was amazing. I think the co-learners, the fellow pilgrims, whatever we're calling them, I think that they liked it too. I mean, it was really fascinating to see Niemöller's house. I mean, this is the parsonage next to the church. That was I guess you would say was the kind of the congregation of the confessing church, and where the Pastors Emergency League started. And we were going through that parsonage where Niemöller lived, and then after the war became a kind of like house of peace. That you probably have more to talk about than I do about that trip, but just kind of like, post-war kind of battles between socialism and communism in the West, and what does it mean to have peace within a kind of nuclear age. A lot of stuff was worked out in that place. So yeah, that was really unique and was a really great experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I really liked about going to the Niemöller house is the way it's structured. and the way it kind of tells the story of the confessing church, and then obviously the role that Niemöller plays, but also the congregation itself, and hearing just how complicated life in the confessing church was during the Nazi movement, that there are these different groups with different comfortability and in ways of resistance, or these kinds of things, that there were different kind of spaces where people broke off from the group because they became more uncomfortable, or the war starts and people move away from the confessing church, or the successes of Hitler and the Nazi movement goes, so they start getting more and more fearful and recede, all the way down to the like that really cool story of finding out that members, when they could basically stay hidden for 3 weeks, would slide their identification card in a little compartment underneath the offering plate.
Yeah, it was
And they
amazing.
had a guy at the church who was such a good artist at doing the pictures that looked like the Nazi ID cards. They would stay in their house for 3 weeks. He'd insert like a picture he drew of someone with some form of Jewish descent, because, you know, they have the one drop rule and stuff. And then they would bike off into Switzerland. And then they would show up 3 weeks later and be like, I lost my card. It's horrible. So the kind of experience any clergy's had at trying to lead a group of people to do something you think is very clear ethically and in the way of Jesus, and how every family has their own negotiating stuff, hearing how that played out to
Yeah.
these, like, who would have thought of using the offering plate to collecting ID cards and setting up a whole, anyway. And
No, I
and
thought that was amazing. Yeah. And it was amazing. I mean, it really added a wrinkle to my other experiences doing this, because we're always just in Bonhoeffer's house and then kind of walking Dietrich's steps, going into the Grenwald neighborhood where he grew up and seeing the family house that he grew up in. But we really are in the parents' downsized house. That's where we're at, where Dietrich had a room. And it's very different. And it reminds you that Dietrich never had to pastor a congregation through this. Like this wasn't, he didn't have that responsibility. But when you go to the Niemöller house, like you see the church, like right out the back window across the cemetery, there's this church, at least one of the places where they worshiped, one of the sanctuaries is right there. So particularly our pastors, and as he said, we didn't have just pastors, but I think our people who are in pastoral ministry, that was really fascinating for them, or it helped them feel what that must be like, or what they're even dealing with now of how you lead a group of people. Some of them who are really significantly engaged in this kind of resistance, and others who are like, I don't know, I just go to this church. I don't know. Like I'm not really sure what I'm doing here, and I agree with my pastor, and I also don't agree with my pastor, and those kind of struggles, I think, really came to life in that space.
mm-hmm. Also, this is also the church Helmut Gollwitzer was senior minister at after Niemöller. Well, not directly after Niemöller, but so it was funny. Like his name comes up, and I'm like, that we're at his church? That's
Yeah,
wild.
your eyes just lit up. You were like,
Well, I mean,
really? Is a pastor here? He's like, yeah, yeah.
I sent Travis McMacken a picture of the pulpit and was like, here's your boy, because he wrote a book on him. That's how I know about him. I was like, it's your boy's pulpit, and I don't think he's received a text from anyone that thinks of the Niemöller house and Niemöller's pulpit is Gollwitzer's, but it's, I just tried to
Yeah.
be nice to him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, our host who oversees both of those houses is pretty. I mean, it's interesting because he's like, the Niemöller house, you have to see it as actually a memorial of failure. Like it didn't work. Yeah, it was just interesting to hear him kind of talk about that and think about those different pastors at that church, and the ones he found were more faithful or direct than the ones who weren't.
Pragmatic.
Yeah.
That's what that's a problem you practical theologians have to deal with. Real theologians just tell the truth about the gospel and its demands in the world,
Yeah.
and then you'll have to figure out the rest of this stuff.
You don't have to worry about the people, but
So there's always that perk as well. So one of the things that went into the trip at the beginning is we asked the group, like, what's the question they're carrying and thinking about, and the overwhelming majority of them came wrestling with thinking about the situation and crises and challenges Bonhoeffer is facing, and then their relationship and connection to our own context. And I imagine that is a relatively new occurrence, that Americans would show up on a pilgrimage to sit in Bonhoeffer's house where he's arrested, and then go, what it like? What does this have to do with my home?
Right.
Having taken groups from the seminary and stuff there before, do you see that as that change is something that's tracking?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first time I did this and taught this Bonhoeffer class in the Bonhoeffer house in Berlin was 2018. So, that's in the middle of Trump one, is first term. And I was really reluctant to make too strong of any parallels, like I was like, like so much of what makes the Nazis is World War One. We haven't had a World War One. We don't have hyperinflation. So, like there's huge differences, and it's so easy. And, like this is something that we've really lived with now, Trip, of, the Bonhoeffer moment being used on both sides. And I was really reluctant to allow the Bonhoeffer moment to be used in one way that I don't like, but then not allowing it to be used in the other too. Just kind of try to be like historically objective here a bit. But then, of course, COVID happened, but then I started teaching it again in 21. Yeah, so 2021. And I've taught it every year, at least one time in Berlin since then. So, then you're in the middle of beginning of, I guess early in the first year of Biden, but then here we are, and I guess Trump too. Yeah, it's really. I think as the election was happening last year, so last summer, as people were looking at the election, and that rhetoric was all there, and then this year, there's just things are much more pointed, and it just feels a bit more like, wow, it feels, yeah, a lot more like we're in the middle of something similar. And I would want to be careful on not trying to like one-to-one parallels here, but there are, like I was the person in 2018 saying, I don't know. And now I'm like, well, there is a way that the Nazi move of trying to tear down democracy from within democracy, kind of tear down the system from within it, that starts to, I think, echo this kind of Trump second term, second time in the presidency. And I think there's just a lot more folks, and we had a lot in our class who just felt the burden more so of like, what do I do? How do I resist? And I think we did have quite a few people who felt kind of on the edges of being able to stay in their congregations, of should they stay, should they go? How do they even think about the church in relation to this? So there's just this interesting Bonhoeffer dynamic in that too, of people feeling like their larger institutional structures are capitulating in some ways to this kind of political move. But the danger, and I think one of the great kind of prophetic lessons Bonhoeffer teaches us, is the danger is to tumble into hating the church. And Bonhoeffer would not allow us to do that. Certain expressions institutionally of the church he thinks could become quite corrupt, all of the German Christians. But it's very easy to kind of tumble into just hating the church. And, Bonhoeffer would be very, yeah. So I found myself trying to kind of balance that this time of what does it mean to fully call a thing what it is, and to see this as a moment of resistance and some really stark parallels at play here, not oversell those for dramatic effect, but to name them. And then what does it mean to hold to an ecclesiology that still reflects Bonhoeffer's sense of Christ's presence in the community, while looking at our institutional structures and
Yeah.
realizing that they're tumbling and failing in some ways.
Yeah, one of the things that at least became more pressing to me there was a conversation I had with a number of clergy one night at a beer garden later in the evening. Yep, it happened. And we earlier that day, I had done a whole little riff thing on like how when understanding Bonhoeffer, you have to understand the incarnation, and that for Bonhoeffer, the incarnation brings the reconciliation of all reality in God. Like all creation, because of the incarnation, already participates in God. And that's because of God's own divine initiative in Christ. And so the participation in the divine doesn't require consciousness of it, and it's not about like claiming Christ, but God's claiming of creation.
Mm.
And that the vocation of the church, he says, comes out of this, right? Like that we're the ones who know the truth about reality, namely that God has redeemed it all in Christ. And
Yeah.
so by our our very life is to point towards that. And the clergy that were there, I'll be vague, so we don't. But they serve in congregations, but in mainline Protestant denominations, which they would normally get called purple churches. Like people with different political parties. And one of them said, "Look," she kind of like looked at me and said, "What do you do when half of your church
Yeah.
sees a part of reality and refuses to be reconciled to it?"
Mm.
And they insist that when you proclaim the gospel, you can't talk about that part of reality. We
Yeah.
can't talk about the kid who is a citizen having their parents taken away.
Right.
That happened in our neighborhood. We can't talk about, and she starts listing off the things that are happening in their community, right? And this is one of the things when I talked about it coming home in a different way and feeling different, is like you and I could talk abstractly about policies and their implications and judge them ethically. But one of the things that she was she was doing a very Bonhoeffer thing, right? Like that it is all about the concrete.
Yeah.
And she goes, so it's not an ethical conversation for me. There are people's names that are attached to it.
Yeah.
Like, do we protect the family of our churches, the janitorial family, the family of the janitorial staff, because it is mixed citizen family and they live scared? Do we put them on a meal chain? Or, she's like
Yeah. Yeah.
going through the list. And then another one of the members is chaplain. And so, then when chaplains serve in all sorts of different contexts where, you are, at least in the American chaplain version, you're a chaplain on behalf of your own tradition, but you're
Mm-hmm.
serving a pluralistic constituency. And she's like, well, what happens when you no longer can see yourself existing with integrity in these contexts and the call of Christ, right? And all of which in the abstract, you and I would have a very different conversation, but then you're looking at someone and then you go, in your life, your income's based on this. And then
Right.
you have this relationship with people. And then it, like, having those conversations about our own context while
Yeah.
sitting there, and you've taught this stuff before. You have a really cool timeline PowerPoint. We're going through his life, and I just had done the whole audio documentary, so we're like seeing who remembers which stories, and it just
Right.
gets more like you can just feel the family by the end of the week all hanging out with you as
Yeah.
the pictures come up, and realizing how concrete that was and how unflinching Bonhoeffer was. And it kind of just, I don't know, it made me not giggle at the, oh, well, Protestants like to treat him like a saint thing,
Yeah.
because the more you get to know his story in the concrete situation, the more challenging it is when thinking about my own context, but also all of those that were there with us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That was really different. I think it's every time I've taught this. I mean, maybe it was starting to change last summer, but this was really the first time that things felt so directly, well, to use your word, concrete. Like
Mm-hmm.
people had these experiences of, I mean, essentially a secret police taking people, like those weren't, this could happen. That was, this is happening. And what is that? What does that mean? What do we do? It was really interesting conversation. And yet, it also is the sense where every time I teach this class, and I start with this little kind of word that I remind people they don't know Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like I think that's one of the great benefits of coming to Berlin and sitting in his house is it's, people have written about this, the Bonhoeffer phenomenon, in the sense like, we all kind of make Bonhoeffer in our own image. And we still do that even in his house, I think it's fair to say. But you do get a sense of his distance from you when you're in his city, in his house. Like you said, after, 3 full days in his house can kind of, you can see where the wall was taken down from his father's office. And, you have this deep sense that he sat back on this patio and walked the same sidewalk and street that you're walking. His otherness, I think, becomes really clear to you. And yeah, I think that's always one of the real powers of this, then to think these concrete situations in real conversation with him and seeing the perplexities that he had to deal with. How does he protect those he loves who are in this house and yet be faithful to the gospel?
One of the places we visit, the what's the Museum of Terror, or what's it?
Yeah, topography of terror, I think
Yeah,
is what it's called. Yeah.
which is I mean, it goes through the history from kind of the rise of the Nazis through kind of how people that participated in it were dealt with, like up to the present. But the bulk of it is telling the story of the secret police, the instruments of power within the state to get cooperation and control and that kind of thing. And, showing back up at his house, because this, so like this was like the second day we were there, we did this a bunch of different spots around Berlin, and showing back up at his house to tell the story of the forming of the conspiracy and all that kind of stuff when the night before you're with clergy in Los Angeles who have been directly impacted by the ICE raids and stuff like that, and then sitting there and then showing up to have that conversation, then get home and realize that the big beautiful bill, I didn't believe this till like a former Republican posted the data that if you do adjustments, income adjustments, now we're funding ICE at a bigger level than the SS was funded
Oh, wow.
in our new budget. I mean, it's also bigger than the Israeli military budget. So, there's that. But then, like, that's happening. These, alligator Alcatraz, these kinds of things, like in what being there, right? And like, the psychological mechanisms at work when you feel anxiety will lead you to catastrophize
Yeah.
and overthink things and all this kind of stuff. And yet, like, there were plenty of people that were rolling their eyes at those that saw what was going on in Germany, until they realized just what was, what they let metastasize. So I feel like in the past, I've had a very similar feeling as you, of just like it being odd when anyone claims, oh, this is a Bonhoeffer moment. And you're like,
Right.
no, like
Right.
they had a brand new democracy in Germany
Right.
that wasn't working well and it was economically screwed.
They
Blah, blah.
got rid of a king,
Yeah.
like,
You're like going through a list of all the things that,
right.
aren't there. But there is a family resemblance enough that I understand why clergy, that was their pressing question.
Yeah.
And then when you hear just how those show up in congregations, and now we're, the you're going to have different versions of those kinds of questions showing up when rural hospitals close and, other stuff like that. So it's, yeah. Anyway.
No, yeah, and that museum that you're referencing, the Topography of Terror, is built on the ground of where the secret police building, the Gestapo, and the SS, where that was bombed out. So it's built right on top of it. And yeah, I mean, that's something that when I first taught this class in 2018, there was no operative secret police. I mean, even if ICE existed then, they weren't kind of empowered like they are now. And yeah, so yeah, it has become the stakes have become higher. I think the perplexity has ramped up, and yet it's maybe even more so. I think a really transformational experience for folks to be there.
Yeah. So, despite the German Christian church movement's kind of Nazi energy and excitement, the leadership of the Nazi Party and its larger vision involved a deep repudiation of Christianity. The German Christian movement responds so positively and is helpful. They're like, well, let's wait till we win the war to eliminate Christianity. But in the meantime, we'll just get all the Jew books out of the Bible, which really limits what can be left of the Bible nonetheless. But, but but we talked about the way in which the Nazi ideology has this sense that, like, to be strong is to be good, like the survival
Yeah.
of the fittest. And it has this kind of dismissal of the genuine, like the humanist vision and the universalist vision of humanist vision,
Yeah.
neither Jew nor Greek, where there's an inheritance and stuff. And when you think of the kind of, in a sense, the gift of Christianity to the West around humanism and universalism, the recognition that the good is tied to the well-being of the weak, in least among us. Like, Bonhoeffer recognized that ideology in Hitler early on, before he was even made chancellor. He comes to call him the tyrannical despiser of humanity. and when he's talking about the tyrannical despiser of humanity, it always shows up as this rejection of, for him, the seeming advance, right, of Western civilization of sorts, right, by in these virtues that he says you can even see him exist with people that aren't Christian. He can name his Jewish friends or secular friends, and he'll talk about unconscious Christianity. You can see
Right.
these virtues existing. So it's not a kind of he's not said in a Christian triumphalistic way, but what are the norms of culture and the virtues that are lifted up, and that undermining of it in the Nazi vision. That's something when I got back that's kind of been irritating me, and I want to know what you think, because you're a practical theologian. So I
Okay.
know that you
Not
haven't.
a good one, but yeah.
I don't know. You got a new book every 6 months. Don't tell anyone if you're not any good at this, Andy. But but the smittenness that people had, this kind of
Mm.
of so many people in the church getting ran over, and then kind of succumbing, becoming bystanders and celebrators of someone who just seems a repudiation,
Yeah.
like the basic Christian virtues. Then I'm sitting there thinking, like, yeah, and Trump is like the least Christian president we've ever had. Not
Right.
in like assessing his morals, not that he's the most moral person of all time, but he also can't think of anything to repent for. So,
Sure.
that's a growing edge to his baby Christian status. But like, in not having the need to even gesture towards a humanitarian ideal, he
Right.
valorizes coercive power in himself and others, and he wants a power that's completely self-legitimating. He demonizes the other and then narrates all relationships with other people in some zero-sum way that's really about him, his pocketbook, his kids, a tower with his name on it. There's in the thing is, there's no residue in him of an uneasy conscience, right? Like, where even former presidents, I think, are war criminals. You could tell that they thought they at least had to pretend they felt bad when they realized there weren't weapons of mass destruction, and
Sure.
they shouldn't have called victory. Or maybe Obama shouldn't have used a drone and end up killing an American citizen. Or, I mean, it wouldn't be hard for me to go through all the presidents of my lifetime and complain about them. But but they also all demonstrated there was something about the leadership where they know it's an inherently compromised position,
Right.
and they could be shamed, and thought that there was a demand on them to be good that they
Yeah.
knew they wouldn't live up to. And he doesn't have any of that. And then he goes around dividing everybody by allegiance to him. And so and that's always like made me roll my eyes. But the being there and spending so much time, and really a lot of the museum stuff where you're like looking at pictures and seeing and hearing the stories of what happened in the congregation when we were there and things. I wonder what you think about the ability for such a large portion of Christians in a nation to be smitten with someone who doesn't even feign it, right? Like, that's
Yeah.
the part that I don't get. It's not like we've always been suckered by people into doing bad things. Human beings are stupid.
Right.
But there's a difference between, oh, I can't. I mean, I have friends that were like, I thought there were weapons of mass destruction, and I joined the
Sure.
military after 9/11, and now I'm like Veterans for Peace.
Yep.
And you're like, yeah, you meant well the whole time. You were trying to do good.
Right.
So does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah. I mean, let me try this trip, and you tell me what you think. I mean, one of the both. Well, I think one of the stark differences, and then also this kind of comes around, and then there's a similarity here. But the thing about Trump, from my perspective, is that he doesn't have a big idea that's driving him other than himself, which I think actually ends up being an idea. But, like for Hitler, it's really clear that he's coming out of the 19th century, and particularly in Germany. I mean, this is a really interesting conversation around, like you were saying, survival of the fittest and the kind of social Darwinianism. But there's also this kind of sense of germ theory that's coming about, and so there's a sense that an organism, that a people is an organism, and that there could become germs inside the organism that could take it down. And the kind of interpretation of what happened in World War One, the defeat of World War One, which I think we do forget this, that the Germans were told, the public was told, we're winning the war, we're winning the war, we're winning the war. And then all of a sudden at the last second they lose. And, as some historians remind us, that the loss was in a way match. Like they didn't lose anything on German soil. They ended up losing on French soil and coming back. And it just felt like, what happened here? And the logic that gets played out that Hitler really believes is that weakness can happen in the body politic, essentially, in the genes of a people, and that weakness, he thinks, is the Jew. So we have to get rid of all forms of weakness, and it will even be weakness. Then, of course, he thinks that the Jew is diabolical because the Jew brings down any society it's within. But there's also other forms of weakness. If you happen to have a disability for the good of the dumb, the German dumb, you have to be eliminated. And this is just science, man. This is just how evolutionary kind of science works. So that utter kind of hatred is both the scapegoating and a kind of demonizing, but it also is just like raw rationalist kind of scientific kind of perspective. And Trump doesn't necessarily have that. Like, he hates weakness, but he doesn't hate weakness because he has some kind of social Darwinian larger narrative that he's living out of. But he is living out of, I think, a core narrative, which is that what moves the world is attention and celebrity. And so what makes every action right for him ultimately is that people watch it. You know what I mean? Like, people find it fascinating. And, so you'll hear Zelensky thing in his office. He's like, well, I mean, he even kind of breaks the fourth wall or whatever. And it's like, this is great television, isn't it? Like, like the fact that this could be picked up as sticky content, like that in itself makes it good. The fact that he isn't boring. And I do think that there's a group of people that have a certain nihilist edge, younger people that have a certain nihilist edge in our society, who've spent most of their life online, that just find it utterly delicious that he is chaotic, and you just can't take your eyes off him. So that's worth it. And then you have another bunch of people who are of other generation who just basically their lives are watching Fox News, and the fact that they're just entertained in a kind of different way by him is justification enough. And the fact that you can get all the swag and the t-shirts, and I mean the fact that it kind of takes on this both celebrity culture and this kind of consumptive impulse becomes the measure of it being good. And I mean that kind of ethically, like, it's good because it's entertaining, so you do have a bit of, the bread and circus thing from the Roman Empire that kind of plays it back, where for Hitler, there is this sense like we have to be against weakness because weakness in everything is a struggle. And for Trump, everything is a struggle, but it's a struggle for attention, for eyeballs. And of course, why I think Trump really is a person of the 80s, you know what I mean? Like, at 80s and 90s, he's at his height, selling pizzas for Pizza Hut. Like, this is the kind of sophistication we have here. But it's not surprising that when we enter into a kind of space where we enter into a fully kind of digital space, where the space of our world as a London School of Economics guy in a recent book has this book, Coldry is his name, where he talks about the space of the world, that he says his book starts by saying we made a terrible mistake 3 decades ago, which we gave over the organization of our primary space of the world to big tech, who are driven by profits. And that was a mistake made essentially by people who leaned left. You think of the Google guys and things like that. But it was all based on attention, competition for attention, kind of addiction to that space. And Trump thrives in it. Trump, if the moral good is not being boring and having people pay attention to you, well, he dominates. And he dominates left-leaning media as well as right-leaning media, as well as the internet. And, he continues to brag about this. You always say, like, I'm number one on Facebook, whatever that means. I don't even know what that means, but it's probably, true. So the driving big idea for him of what's good and why weakness must be opposed is because the moral good is attention and reach of celebrity. And that's the struggle. The struggle is to be seen and to be famous, and not the struggle to have a people fight necessarily, I think.
I wonder if there are some similarities. What are the similarities between the two that make them? They both have had the ability of showing up and within 10 years going from obscurity to the
Yeah.
life of the church to shaping the boundary marker for large portions of it. And they do so both with like where the virtue that drives them is occupies very little space in scripture, where you don't see it, it's just, they're just not, they weren't like compelling because of their virtue, morality, or trustworthiness or this kind of thing. And I wonder if part of it is, do you see that they both harness this kind of attention? And there's lots of interesting research just about the way the Nazi party used a new technology for propaganda purposes and all that kind of stuff, and the way in which they both seize a deep allegiance for where so many individuals can't differentiate their allegiance to their leader to their allegiance to Christ. They both prey off of grievances in the
Yeah.
community. There's that similarity. Both of them narrate their own story in the as the story of the country,
Yeah.
and one of a success after success, regardless of what is going on around them. But after it, while being in Europe, but the kind of like after spending that week, I kept thinking of like the way the Confessing Church or the Barmen Declaration, Bonhoeffer, Barth, these kind of individuals responded to it was calling it idolatry
Right.
and a return to God's self-revelation in Christ.
Mhm.
And obviously in Germany, the influence of both Luther and the Reformed tradition and stuff make this proclamation of the word and stuff central in ways that American Protestantism doesn't center it in that way. I wonder, like, what are the things to be gained from thinking along with the theologians of the word, right? Like in dealing with that kind of ideology and such like that, and what are there other avenues or spaces for theological reflection to try and address kind of a growing like idolatry?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this is I mean, I don't know. This is the challenge. And I find this part hard when talking about Bonhoeffer, even in the class, because there's certain ways that it rubs up against our experience and what we hold as really kind of sacred forms of resistance now, that I think doesn't necessarily, or is different than where these theologians of the word that you're getting at. And I tend to feel kind of pulled into their perspective. I mean, these are, the people who taught me how to think theologically and, opened up my world to me. So I feel sometimes like I'm a person of the 20th century, or I'm a 1900s person. And and so, but I think one of the elements is this, what you said earlier, Trip, is that I worry that in the midst of this, the way the machine of the platform and the way that we have to inhabit this kind of digital space of the world ourselves, it really does reward forms of violence, really, violent discourse, a kind of sense of outrage. It it lifts those up. And so some certain theological commitments that I think are essential to combat this can easily get eroded within that. And I do think one that you mentioned earlier is like a universal claim of the good of humanity. Like it's amazing how much I see people on the left have assertions like we'll say things like, you could just go die, or like like we don't care about you, or like there's this way that the personhood of the other can easily be lost in the midst of this kind of political fight. And I do think particularly Bonhoeffer, but Barth plays this tune too, as well as Bruner and others, is that there is a way that the kind of personalist dynamic, kind of philosophically, the place of the person and what it means to be human is to be person, which means to be, as Bonhoeffer would say, a will, but also bound to others. Never not bound to others, but also a will. So you're both will and communion. You know, you're connected and differentiated at the same time. That this does give a kind of a way into a universal value of the person, and I worry that we lose that. You know, Susan Neiman's book that we referenced in the class, What We Can Learn from the Germans, is really about memory and what it means to kind of memorialize sites. And she's, as a person who was raised in the South in Atlanta and has lived as a Jewish woman in Germany and then in Israel and then back in Germany, is trying to say the way the Germans have tried to remember this moment, particularly, it took them a long time. It took a long time, but really since 2000, the way they've done memory, and we saw a lot of that when we were in Berlin, can teach us a lot of what it means to not just rip statues down, but what it means to put up monuments to remember and to take responsibility. But she also, her other book, and she would definitely see herself as someone of the left, but her book, Woke is Not Left, is really interesting. And she thinks that the kind of the new left that she's talking about has sold out some of the core values of the left. And one of them is this claim of universal humanity, that every human being has inherent value. And inside a kind of all-out fight for power, where power is the highest good, hence winning attention so you can win your elections or you can win the power, that it easily leads us to try to rank who gets to talk and who doesn't get to talk, whose humanity matters and whose humanity doesn't matter. And that it does, ironically, she tries to draw this parallel. It takes a very Carl Schmitt kind of perspective, which that the world isn't made up of human beings, all made in some sense sharing in the family of humanity, but there's just enemies and friends, and you have to decide who's your enemy and who's your friend. And that's the battle going on. And that's something I do see that Trump really plays out. I mean, just absolutely. Like, there's only enemies and friends. You are either for me or you're against me. And you have no inherent value once you're against me. And anything I can do to destroy you and have the system destroy you, I'll do it, even if you're in Brazil. Yeah, well, I mean, we are seeing this with these tariffs. That these tariffs are actually revenge moves on countries.
Here's a question, and we didn't get to talk about it in the class, but it was something I really wanted to know what you think about. We, at the end, we spent more time on the 10 years after stuff and ethics than the letters and papers, religionless Christianity thing. But one of the questions around it that I've been thinking about is, he's reading Dilthey and The World Come of Age, in this sense that a lot of religious thinkers have just assumed that part of being human is being religious, that there's this like religious a priori, there's like the religious bug in the person, and like you're trying to like work out how to do it. And then the role of God in culture and ethics, any good, true, beautiful discussion, God is function as like the legitimation structure or the working hypothesis. He'll say stuff like that. And in it, he talks about God being pushed out of the world, all the way onto the cross. And at that same time, Christ becomes the sinner. So you get this possibility for a religionless Christianity or unconscious Christianity. And that the starting point for faith isn't the human's religious search, but the divine initiative for salvation, right? And one of the things that's kind of struck me is, his vision of religionless Christianity and things, when you set it alongside so much of the other stuff in the letters or in ethics, still presumed a legacy of Christendom in the West.
Yeah.
Right. And so the active participation in a Christian community, the being religious that way, right? He's like, I don't even know if I like talking about God if religious people are around. He tells Eberhard, it just makes me uncomfortable. I don't even think they take the word seriously. We got to learn how to say and do all these things again. We just need basically like the Eucharist and baptism and the care for the other. Maybe the church should sell everything. Like, he's doing all of this. And I used to respond to that really differently than I do now. Even though I think it makes perfect sense there. But I wonder if he might and me growing up in the South might have underestimated the historical gift of Christianity to
Right.
Western consciousness. Right.
Right.
If we go back to those themes we mentioned earlier, like humanism, universalism, the value of the weak, those kind of
Right.
things. And I wonder if Bonhoeffer there is thinking something similar to what when Tom Holland talks about like the different ways
Yeah.
you could see it going forward. He uses the spaceship image, right? Like there's
Mhm.
Christianity or like the booster rockets that get
Yeah.
these ethical commitments of the West in the air, and then they fall away because you've got
Yeah.
past gravity. But humanism, universalism, value of the weak, those things are the shuttle, and they're still going into space and doing their mission. And I wonder if that isn't in like Bonhoeffer there, a lot of progressive Christian theologians or radical theologians, if a lot of us haven't just figured that's how it works, and
Right.
perhaps that's not exactly how it's going.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, this will be another podcast. We'll have to do at another time, Trip. But I've been reading. Have you ever read or did we talk about Philip Reef? Have you ever heard Philip Reef? You know that
Huh.
name? So I almost kind of hesitate to mention him because he's been kind of more read by more conservative folks that is because he's curmudgeonly, he University of Chicago guy, kind of mid-century, was the reader of Freud, basically.
Reef?
Rief. And so he was a big interpreter of Freud at mid-century, like was overseeing the publication of Freud's papers, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, like late 50s or whatever, and then just stopped writing. He was married to Susan Sontag, and they had, like, I don't know the backstory of this, but it seems like the 60s did not go very well for his marriage. And he just, like, stopped writing and just was done until towards the end of his life. And so he's at the University of Chicago and then was at Penn. But he does this really kind of fascinating thing where he thinks Freud is a genius. He thinks Freud's interpretation is right, that we have desires that, exist within us, all Augustine in some ways. But then society is there to repress those desires, to tell us that our deepest desires can't function. That's a very, very fast and flat read of Freud. But what Reef's basic point is that Freud lost nerve and he didn't take his theory the full direction. And what Freud never asked was, well, what gives society, what allows society to repress some of these things, to essentially have a you shall not do this or you shall not do that. And he says, well, this is what society does, this is what culture does, and it always is some kind of reflection on a sacred order. There's some kind of sacredness at play that sets the kind of ethical reality.
Mm-hmm.
And he calls this third culture, this kind of Freudian culture, because he thinks first culture is a kind of pagan society where there really isn't an ethical system at play. You're just living out of fate and destiny. You're just going to the seer to figure out what the gods really think. The gods are caprice, that you don't know what they really want, what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do. If you're a Roman elite, it doesn't matter if you murder your slave or not. There's no shall or shall not. You can do whatever you want. But then when the revolution of Judaism and then Christianity and then
The
then
axial
Islam,
age period.
the axial age period comes about, and it gives you very strict shalls and shall nots because it's a kind of revealed religion. This God reveals God's self, and so now you need to do certain things, and you need to renounce certain things, even good things, say like marriage or sex. You need to renounce those. At least a group of people needs to, so that they can pray or whatever. But the Freudian move is to be opposed to all that renunciation, all that shalls, that shall nots. But his whole point is that there has to be some kind of sacredness at play. And then now the new sacredness that comes at play is just simply to tear down. And that works for a while, but he says it eventually can't hold and you'll get a fourth culture. And what's fascinating is he thinks fourth culture might be, and he just, like, these were thoughts he had as he was dying, is maybe fourth culture will be a return to a kind of monasticism in some ways. But he says it will also be a return to an authoritarianism
Mm-hmm.
because people can't handle not having any authority. So in a dark way, it'll be a return to a kind of authoritarianism. And I do think one of the dangers that you're pointing at here is in this kind of spaceship analogy where, yeah, we hold on to certain ethical norms, so we don't need any of the ritualization, we don't need any of the practices, we don't need any of the creeds, even. Where like, because Reef's point is creeds are
Yeah.
always the interconnection with the charism of the revealed word. You get rid of all of that, and eventually you have no sacredness. And then what your elites become, like our elites become, and Reef thinks cultures are always changed by their elites, which I think is a fascinating point, is if then your elites are actually taking their eliteness by deconstructing any ethical systems, not by giving any. And eventually that works for a while, and maybe it can work for 80, 90 years, but eventually it ends up falling in on itself. And the only thing you get in that third culture is a kind of hyper therapeutic culture that becomes utterly focused on the self. And I think this is what's happened with religion, that religion now is not about a kind of ethical system that gives you rituals and ways into the sacred and forms of action that connect to the sacred. Religion, even in its very, well, even more so in its kind of evangelical form, becomes a kind of self-help way to, well, it becomes a therapy, religion as therapy. So I think Bonhoeffer kind of felt like religion would just disappear. And I think what's actually happened is religion has become a kind of consumer wellness therapy that actually ends up not being able to hold any water of the necessity of the ethical norms that we need. And so, yeah, I'm with you on the way. If religionless Christianity means trying to have a society where you could still maybe be a Christian or be a confessional Christian, but you don't have any kind of infrastructure of the sacred within your society or cannot point to it in any kind of way, I don't know how that occurs. And I think Reef is kind of prophetic in that way.
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating because, and we mentioned it briefly at some point when we were talking about both of us having an interesting experience reading Tom Holland's Dominion,
Yeah.
because because he uses the spaceship metaphor as one option, but then the other two, you think of where Christian belief and ethics recede together, and then there he talks about similar to what Reef was saying, that where then new authoritarianisms emerge
Right.
because essentially human relations outside of those most immediate need a law that generates expectation, social cohesion, the ability to generate trust, and all these kinds of things. And when the the inherited institutional powers don't work, then we need an authority figure, and
Right.
they become self-legitimating because of the sheer anxiety, lack of trust or a lack of connection to institutions, and
Right.
and really a horizon of possibility for your own agency. And then
Right.
the other one, that he talks about is a return to the root of these ethical things and some kind of rebirth or reorientation of Christian identity. And I wonder, and this is kind of just popping in my head because of the you mentioning his connection with Freud and the role he gave of essentially the axial period of, but when we think of religion before belief, before the axial period, they were these kind of communal enactments of wonder, wisdom, community, narrative, these kinds of things, but they weren't, they were ordering human relations, but and the community's relationship to the divine, but not in there wasn't any anticipation of the consistency of something like the good or the true, right? Like these kinds of things. In the axial period, then the concept of the good becomes regulatory for both your understanding of God and the world and how you should relate. And then you get another big shift, which, if you think of modernity, there you get this kind of religion as belief, right? Where Protestantism is battling out. And then religion without belief, which Freud and any of the masters of suspicion, false consciousness, deal with, and both of them come on. So I wonder what the one of the challenges, especially for people like you and I that probably enjoy reading early Protestants, is like if we think of religion before belief and the role and function it plays, and the
Mm-hmm.
preservation of the beautiful parts of what's come before. The biggest challenge for Protestants is going to be thinking of religion beyond beliefs, where not without, but like beyond them as normative and binding and kind of
Right.
and something else becoming normative. And I think that place, a lot of what Bonhoeffer talks about is really helpful, because religion beyond the belief is religion is Christ in the face of the other, right?
Right.
Where and it's in that face of the other that those big gifts or virtues, right? Like a deep, thick humanism, a universalism, an evaluation of the weak, those things become palpable and demanding,
Yeah.
but without the infrastructure of intellectual assent and authority, or the kind of cultural colonialism that can exist when one version of Protestantism that makes sense in this place gets, exported elsewhere. It seems to me there's some possibilities for, especially those that are living within a tradition and want to hand it on. Like, what is
Right.
handing it on when you see a bigger story of movement going? Like,
Right.
do we really need all the mainline Protestant denominations still not cooperating as they all dwindle in 100 years because of debates about the presence of the Eucharist? Like, is that really
Right.
a good idea? I don't
Right.
think so. But you know what I mean? But if we still exist in traditions that
Yeah.
have normative power to particular doctrines, that seems problematic for
Yeah.
what's next. And Bonhoeffer's like clearing the deck modality might be helpful.
Yeah. And this is my, I don't know, my growing edge on thinking about Bonhoeffer is, and we'll see where this goes with my own project, but is to think of him. I always get annoyed reading Bonhoeffer scholars who do not give enough attention to the relationships that are so important to him, like to the familial relationships, to the friendships, to all that. Because I think this is to take us full circle trip here. I mean, this is what I think going on the class and being part of this class is so important, is you cannot get the humanity of Dietrich Bonhoeffer out of your system. You're in his house. But I'm really fascinated. I do think Bonhoeffer is somewhat of a mystic in a kind of very different way, not necessarily a Meister Eckhart way, not in a kind of medieval way, but in this sense that responsibility to the neighbor becomes a kind of mystical category for him, and it becomes concrete, it becomes lived. And I do think that the dynamic of this, which I want to develop more, is the reality of him being a twin, and what it means to be in the middle of his sister's life and his sister in the middle of his life, and what it means for them. And they're obviously not identical twins, they're male and female, they're fraternal twins. So there's both a differentiation and a union that is at the core of his very understanding of his own existence. And I think he's working that theologically, and he wants to place the very presence of Jesus Christ in this union that he has with this other human being. That is what it means to really care for her, what it means for her to care for him. Like, in that dynamic of the gift of being with and for each other, he wants to find Jesus Christ there. And so there is a kind of confessional move that has to happen within that, but it doesn't become kind of rigidly, yeah, rigidly kind of a philosophical debate about the Eucharist, but it really is about how does one encounter the presence of a living God. That becomes, I think, so significant, and that will take real embodied, real lived, real communal realities, I think, and not just ideas, and not just consent to belief, but actual embodied experiences. Which, again, I don't know, I'm taking us full circle again, but is why I think learning Bonhoeffer's story in his house, in his city, is yeah, it opens up angles.
Yeah. I think that's hopeful. If you shift the focus from like faith in a sense being sustained by understanding or naming or articulating the beliefs, which no one says that's what they really do, except they have not seen most confirmation curriculum, and
Right.
uh, and or what we all have fights about when churches split and all that kind of thing. It is an interesting feature, I think, of Bonhoeffer's a kind of relational mysticism of sorts, and in thinking about it being that he was never he was never a solitary self who like met older and younger siblings. It was always as a twin.
Yeah.
The if in that sense the threats right to faith in a more embodied form aren't going to be like, oh well, science is blah 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 blah, or oh there's multiple traditions running around or whatever. It's going to be the powers that actually shape our embodiment. And
Yeah.
thinking about Nick Coldry's book and all the kind of stuff on digital colonialism and things, and the way algorithms and technology have occupied more and more of our space and attention, kind of made us addicted to fascination and all sorts of stuff, along with the way the larger neoliberal economic system has continued to feed off people's finitude and time and make much less of a person's humanity available to itself, as more and more of its time is now being monetized by our attention and addiction to screens. Like, I mean, they're just like, if you think of like, oh, what are the threats? Oh,
Yeah.
you're gonna let your kid go to college, and then they're gonna read Nietzsche, and he said God is dead. Or
Right.
and you're like, I wish more atheists read Nietzsche. He's pretty a lot
Yeah,
more thoughtful.
absolutely.
But the
Instagram, that's the threat.
yeah, it's like the Masters of Suspicion. Those are provocative.
Yeah, I would love my kids to be reading Marx.
It's the Instagram memes.
Right. It's the what happened to 4 hours as I just watched reel after reel after reel after reel after reel, and my spirit is just eroded.
Uh-huh. Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful, and it makes me think there's a high quality meme about the problem of memes. All those ones of people that are like in an airplane and they're like, I'm raw dogging my flight, where they use no screens their entire flight.
I know. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
about like I was raw dogging church,
Yeah.
and they leave their phone in the car.
Yeah.
And
Well, Tripp, you have to. This is not my story. This is Tony Jones' story, but you have to ask him at some point, because the original Raw Dog Your Flight is actually the very important just deceased theologian Jürgen Moltmann. And Tony tells a great story about dropping him off at the airport after an event and asking him what he's going to do on his flight from Chicago back to Germany. He's like, do you listen to music? Do you watch movies? And I don't want to blow it. It's Tony's story, but he says Moltmann said to him, I review my memories.
yeah,
So there's the original, like, you're just raw dogging your
See,
flight. You're just
that's a
with
whole new
yourself.
avenue to sell some Moltmann books.
There you go.
You're like the Crucified God, Raw Dog Edition.
You're gonna have Tony tell the story. It's his story, and I find it very amusing.
It's like the
He tells it very well too.
It's the Under the Sheets game, but with Raw Dog. Like, never mind. Everything that just came in my mind is funny. But if you take hymns and add the phrase raw dog after it, it can be funny. Look, pastors' kids, that was what we did when we got real bored on hymn sing nights, is we all knew everyone else in our cousins and siblings are thinking Under the Sheets once they announce every hymn. So they're like, oh, Amazing Grace. And then all of us look at each other and just giggle. And oh, come thou fount of every blessing, and then you just like giggle, and like some of them are just like really wrong, and then you don't want to laugh, but you do anyway. I don't know. Baptists don't have purgatory, but if we did,
that would get you.
They're like, man, y'all love hymn sing night. Yeah, I do. Well, yeah. So when's the next time you're going?
I'll take my Luther students next June, and probably it looks like there's another congregation with my friend Carol who's going to bring a group, and so next June.
Cool.
And people can contact me. There may be some spots, but I know you and I, Trip, are going to also talk about doing something. We're Americans, so it's got to be bigger and better.
Yeah.
We're going to maybe in 2027 we'll try to do something that will link in more directly to the Niemöller house, but we'll see what happens with that.
Oh yeah, it'll be fun. And I would say if you're a congregation, because the space at the Bonhoeffer house is great for groups 15, 25, And if you're, it's the kind of thing, Arno, who's there, wonderful guy, could totally help if you want to end up having a group visit. And it's hard to kind of overstate the experience of being in his house while you're reading the book he wrote there, or being like, hey, Andy, I'll start talking about it and then we'll talk back and forth. And then 45 minutes later, I wrap up and
Yeah,
Andy said nothing. You know,
I loved it. I loved it. I had plenty of time to talk through my timeline and to tell the family stories, and then we just dropped the quarter and trip, and he just told us about the first 2 lines of ethics for 45
well, they're
minutes.
really good lines.
They're great lines, and honestly, they your pieces were amazing. So I loved it.
Look, in Edinburgh, when I got asked to do one of the reading groups with the PhD students, I'm like, sure, sure. And that's kind of what I do. It's like I have my notes and I'll start talking and then I'll hopefully get interrupted and then we'll go back and forth. And I very quickly learned that is not how they do it there. But the American students were so entertained by me being excited because the modality in Edinburgh is, even if like you could be a scholar on someone, like you're like, I love Schleiermacher. I'm a Scottish Schleiermacher liberal Christian, and this is the most important theologian to me. They talk about him as if they're like in third person, like it's not like it moves your soul or whatever. And I don't really lecture that way. And so I tend to play whoever I'm reading. And so we were reading the opening of Process and Reality, which of course these science and religion students, the first time you read it, it's just like taking medicine.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh, I'm going to make this thing pop. And I wind myself up. I'm so excited. I'm like, we're going to meet the first time in the room where he gave the lectures. Because he preached them down each week. Yeah. Less people showed up after each talk, down to like 6 by the time he got to the end. And I was like, so y'all, what do y'all think? I'm like trying to not do my normal thing, Yeah. Sarah's like, you can't just, you got to dial it back. And I'm like, so what do y'all think? And they're like, so what made him want to give this as a Gifford lecture? And I'm like, well, don't you know what the Gifford lecture is? And the Giffords, and I'm like describing it. And then I'm like, okay, well, you got to think through what had happened the 5 or 6 years before into giving it. And I like start like telling the history of it and natural theology. And I'm like, and here were the changes in science. So in science in the modern world, he was, and I'm like telling his life story and going it through, and the time's over. And I was like, so yeah, y'all got to come up with some questions for next week. And it showed up the next time, and there were more people there. And I was like, I beat Whitehead. He lost people after his first, and I got more to come.
Got more.
And one of the guys that had joked after it, they said, that was the easiest reading group any of us have ever been to. And we're about to start, and he raises his hand, and he opens the book, and he goes, so like when Whitehead says, and he reads like one of the sentences from the first of it, what's up with that? And he just set the book down and sat down.
And then you're off.
That was like, game on.
Well, that happened to us in that Bonhoeffer for us, but it was great. It was great trip. So it was a pleasure to teach with you, man, and to debrief it on this conversation.
All righty. And if I remember, then I'll put the email underneath this for those that might be interested in joining us in 2 years. Yeah. And I'll put you on the list because other people have already messaged about it after this one was full. And that way we'll remember to tell you.
That'd be cool. We'll try to do something on 27. So save your airline miles.
Oh, yeah.